Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire, and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at the intellectual history of the U.S. Constitution, and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better address and understand contemporary social and political issues. Now, what I'd like to chat about today is the ongoing illegal and unjust war in Iran, the world's reaction to it, and particularly the world's reaction to our current president's threat to end a civilization, to commit genocide, and potentially to do so through a nuclear holocaust, and whether the world's reaction to that threat heralds the end of the US's status as the global superpower. Now, there are a number of other things in the news that inform this topic and my position that I think this is the end of the US's status as the global superpower. Now, this war by no means is the only factor that has brought about this end. However, I think when historians write this part of history, they will point to this moment as the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back, that this was the point of no return that marked the end of the US's status as a superpower. So to understand how I formulated this position, we're going to look at the founders and use that to understand what underpins the United States' status as a global superpower, and thus why I think it's the end of that status for the United States moving forward. And moreover, how we can respond to this moment in a meaningful way that can lead to a better future. As we've discussed in previous videos, the founders' view of international relations or geostrategy focused on peace and stability through collective security agreements, political and economic integration to support those collective security agreements, and to do so through an overarching legal structure or system. So this was one of the most powerful arguments for ratifying the US Constitution. The Articles of Confederation did not seem to be providing the security and stability necessary for the United States. And so the US Constitution proposed to facilitate economic and political integration through the institution of the federal government and federal laws that would allow states to trade with one another and settle their disputes in a means short of war. Also, the founders hoped that their experiment in democracy and self-governance would inspire other nations to try their own. They would be a city on a hill, or in the words of James Wilson, the United States would inspire other peoples to erect their own temples of liberty, to try democracy, in part with the idea that democracies tend to interact more peacefully, or that was the theory. So more democracies would mean a more stable, collaborative, and thus prosperous world. Everybody would be better. Now, some such as James Wilson also envisioned what we call international law and the ICC, or International Criminal Court. The idea was that if the federal government worked in the United States to give states something short of war, force, and violence to settle their disputes, we could do this at an international level by codifying the law of nations, as it was referred to at that time. Essentially, in Wilson's vision and some of the other founders, we could create a world where force and violence and war were obsolete, and instead, liberty, justice, equality, and democracy reigned. Now, we can see a great deal of resonance between these founding principles and ideas about international relations and the institutions, structures, and rhetoric that underpin the United States' status as the global superpower. Now, a superpower is defined by its unrivaled ability to project power across the globe. Now, this isn't just military power, but economic, political, and cultural. Now, this ability to project power and resonance with these founding principles is clear in the institution of NATO, as again, we discussed in a previous video. NATO is very clearly a collective security agreement. Article 5 defines that. An attack against one is an attack against all. Now, what this does is it makes defense easier, But it also means the United States has bases and allied bases throughout Europe that allow the United States to project military power, particularly in Europe and the Middle East. Now, Article 2 of the NATO Treaty also lays the groundwork for political and economic integration. That is its clearly stated goal and one of the goals of NATO as an organization. What this does is create a further avenue for the United States to project economic and political power through Europe, as well as better collaborate with them. Now, this institution has benefited the United States and Europe greatly. But for the United States, NATO is one of the key components that makes the United States a global superpower and allows it to project power throughout the world. Similarly, the United States' involvement in the creation of international law and institutions like the UN also allowed the United States to project economic and political power throughout the world and also resonate with those founding ideas and ideals about international relations and geostrategy. The ideal the UN Charter points to is greater economic and political integration, providing a means short of war to settle disputes between nation states. And its assertion of self-determination is meant to inspire democratic self-governance. Now, because the United States was involved in its creation, this provides a means for the United States to project its economic, political, and cultural power through these institutions and through this legal framework. For instance, we have rules on trade and trade agreements. We can have embargoes and sanctions. And due to the Security Council, this can also apply to military force. Moreover, the United States' ability to project economic power throughout the world is epitomized in the US dollar's standing as the world reserve currency, specifically the US petrodollar's standing as the world reserve currency. This gives the United States an exorbitant amount of power over the world and benefits the United States greatly. Furthermore, we project cultural power through the rhetoric through which we define our military, economic, and political interventions throughout the world. Since World War II, we have claimed to be the defenders of democracy, trying to spread liberty and justice throughout the world. Again, resonating with those founding ideals about international relations and geostrategy, the idea of creating temples of liberty. Now, we can argue whether this rhetoric was aspirational or merely farcical. However, this rhetoric was powerful and it inspired other countries to want to follow us. This is part of what made us powerful, these promises and ideals. Now, all of these components help create what we call the US-led rules-based international order. And it's the fact that we lead that order that defines the United States as a superpower. This order allows us to project military, economic, political, and cultural power throughout the globe in an unparalleled manner. And if it ends, and it looks like it is, it would spell the end of the United States as the world's global superpower. Now, as I implied earlier, the current administration did not begin this decline and is solely responsible for it. However, they clearly increased the rate and potentially put the final nail in the coffin. In past decades, the United States has strayed from this rhetoric and founding ideals. We can see this particularly in the regime change wars. In many of them, particularly in the 70s and 80s, the United States deposed democratically elected governments and imposed dictators that were friendly to U.S. businesses. We can see this in Guatemala and throughout Central and South America. We can also see this in Iran, where the democratically elected government was overthrown because they didn't want to share their oil with U.S. and British companies, and instead decided to impose the Shah on the Iranian people, as we discussed again in an earlier chat. We can also see this historically in past decades when the United States either attempts to circumvent or deliberately breaks international law and ignores international institutions. This has also led to undermining our leadership of the rules-based order. We can see this quite clearly in the 2003 Iraq War, where the US president and his administration lied to and provided false evidence to justify that illegal war. And furthermore, we did not hold those leaders accountable either at home or in front of the international community. When laws don't apply to everyone and there aren't consequences for everyone, law no longer carries the authority of law. Instead, it becomes seen as simply a means to project power and to present a moral fig leaf for the actions of the stronger. It's a way to justify and hide might makes right, which is the antithesis of law. Now, the current administration has done both those things. However, they've also implicitly and explicitly attacked every element of the international order that makes the United States a superpower. We can see this in the attacks on NATO and threatening to attack NATO allies. The current president of the United States has even gone so far as to threaten to remove the United States from NATO. In his rantings blaming NATO allies for the current mess that he started in Iran, he said that NATO is a paper tiger. However, it's the current president's actions and rhetoric that are transforming NATO into a paper tiger. And we can see how the loss of our allies will impact the United States' ability to project military power throughout the Middle East and Europe. Right now, our NATO allies are no longer allowing the US military to use their bases or airspace, which is greatly deterring the United States' ability to carry out operations in Iran. Not to mention that they are not coming to help us like they have in our previous wars in the Middle East. We often forget that most of the NATO members went to Afghanistan, a few less went to Iraq, and none are coming this time. As it concerns the United States' ability to project economic power, the president's tariffs or trade war has completely disrupted the global economic system. The apparent result of this is that other countries are renegotiating trade deals and supply chain routes that circumvent the United States and are beginning to exclude the US from the global economy. This also includes nations, including our allies, negotiating directly with Iran as it concerns trade in oil as well as peace. Again, the United States is being excluded from the global order. These efforts have only increased with the closing of the Strait of Hormuz caused by the president's war of choice in Iran. This is threatening to plunge the global economy into a recession or even depression and is beginning to undermine the standing of the US petrodollar as the world reserve currency, which will not only inhibit the United States' ability to project economic power through that tool, but likely cripple the US economy. Trade, cooperation, and collaboration makes everybody more prosperous. And the current administration seems to be trying very hard to destroy that and do the opposite. Moreover, the current administration's flaunting of international law by explicitly stating that we're doing this for the oil undermines international law and transforms it into merely a means of projecting power. The rules apply to you, but not to me. If the United States doesn't follow it and doesn't even claim to try to follow it, why does anyone else have to? This creates a world of might makes right that makes us all less safe, even if it is the current administration's stated foreign policy that we can do whatever we want because we have the biggest guns. Well, we're seeing in Iran that isn't the case. And that seems to be the clear sign that this is the end of the US's status as the global superpower. The current administration has failed to achieve any of the goals or aims that it's put forward in the past month and a half, and failed to do so against a country that has been sanctioned and isolated for decades. And this failure is leading experts in other countries around the world to recalculate US power. Is this really the country we want to ally with? Should we really be scared of them? Are they really a superpower? Now, we see something similar with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia went in claiming it would take 3 days to liberate Ukraine. And many experts thought that was the case. They thought Ukraine would crumble very quickly. They haven't. And it's led the world to devalue Russia as a threat and to recognize the strength and power of Ukraine. Every day this war continues in Iran, the United States looks weaker, inept, and incompetent, and honestly evil. Well, the Iranian regime looks stronger and more legitimate. To the rest of the world, this appears to be a clear sign that the United States is not as powerful as everyone thought. And they're re-questioning whether they want to continue to follow our rules-based order or create their own, as the Canadian Prime Minister proposed. And as he argued and asserted in that speech, there was a rupture in the US-led rules-based international order. And what I'm arguing is that rupture seems to be fatal. And if it is fatal, it's the end of the United States as the global superpower. So how do we respond to this moment? Well, I think first and foremost, we realign with our founding ideals about stability and peace and prosperity through collective security, collaboration, and law. And we really try to live up to those and not just use them as rhetoric as a means to project cultural power. And that means holding our elected leaders accountable. The President of the United States threatened genocide, implying a nuclear holocaust. That has to be unacceptable. And if we want to regain any semblance of a standing in the world again, we have to live up to that rhetoric and those ideals and hold those leaders accountable. Now, articles of impeachment have been put forward in the House of Representatives, and that's a good start depending on how it plays out in the Congress. That's not a conviction, that's just starting proceedings. However, it's going to take a lot more work and a lot longer to earn the trust of the world back. Not only have we broken international law and reneged on treaties and diplomacy, the current administration agreed to a ceasefire and then broke it. They were in negotiations and started a war. We had the nuclear agreement with Iran that the current president removed the United States from, even though it was working. It's going to take a long time and a lot of work to prove to the rest of the world that we are trustworthy again. And moreover, because we elected this president a second time, after knowing what he was capable of and that he was demonstrably unfit for office, the rest of the world, and Europe in particular, sees this as a fool me twice, shame on me moment. It's going to be a long time before the world trusts us to choose good leaders and hold them accountable. And particularly, hold them accountable before they start killing people in other nations, before they start destroying other countries, before they threaten genocide and war crimes, and oh, not to mention, threaten to collapse the global economy, potentially causing famines and impoverishing people around the world. The rest of the world is recalculating and saying we cannot trust these people ever again, and also we can't trust any nation with this much power. And I think they're right to think that way. No one nation should have this much power. The very idea of being a superpower or a hegemon is kind of antithetical to our founding ideals. Ideals like equality, liberty, justice, democracy, being the sole nation in charge that projects power through other nations is rather antithetical to those founding ideals. The power that comes with that status, I think, has corrupted us as a nation. And we can see in history, every time the United States turns towards this kind of power, towards imperialism, we turn away from these founding ideals, both abroad and at home. And this turn towards imperialism often impoverishes normal Americans and leads to regressions that remove liberties, that undermine justice at home. The weight of empire impoverishes all of us at home. We're spending potentially trillions on a war of choice while people here don't have health care. They can't eat. They can't buy homes. We're not doing great at home. Moreover, being that superpower makes us less safe, especially in the means that we've enforced it over the past decades. We've discussed this again in a previous video, the idea of blowback. The use of military force in a world of might makes right radicalizes people and makes the United States a target. This isn't good for us, and this isn't good for the rest of the world. So if we realign with our principles and hold our leaders accountable, over time, we can regain our standing within the international community. However, it won't be as the superpower or hegemon. And I think that's a good thing. What the United States could be is a leader through collaboration, inspiration, support. We could live up to our ideals and really help other peoples create their own temples of liberty, to collaborate with them, to trade with them, to exchange cultures, to be a good neighbor. This would make us all safer and more prosperous. It would certainly diminish the possibility of more forever wars. We could, as James Wilson advocated, love other nations and help them reach their own perfection, and that those other nations would in turn help us reach our own. We could have a more peaceful, stable, and democratic world, a world where liberty and justice is the ideal that we're all attempting to realize. However, this current administration and president seems bent on plunging us into a world of might makes right, where they say, if I can't have it, no one can. And that makes us all less safe. And that makes war the only means to communicate and settle disputes between nations. It makes us the bad guys. That's what the ongoing war in Iran shows to the rest of the world and demonstrates, that we are now the bad guys. And that's the choice that's before us. Do we want to try to be the good guys, to earn back the trust of the world through collaboration and support and just being a good neighbor, even if just to our own allies? Or are we really okay with being the bad guys? Are we really okay with the leader of our country threatening to end a whole civilization, genocide, nuclear holocaust? This president needs to be held accountable for our own sake as a nation, but for the rest of the world, and particularly the Iranian and Lebanese civilians who are living through hell right now and being killed. This is not okay. And moreover, if we do hold these people accountable and realign with our founding ideals, we'll also help revive our own democracy, potentially leading to the rebirth of our republic, of self-governance in this country. Because if we build that political will and solidarity to hold our leaders accountable, we can use that to also force our elected officials to address our needs at home. And moreover, without the weight of empire, we'll have more money and resources to do this. This is not good for us or anyone else in the world. And we have to take up our duty and responsibility of citizenship, of advanced citizenship that democracy requires, and address these things and stop this unjust and illegal war. That is the choice before us. Do we want to be the good guys, or are we okay being the bad guys? Do we really want to live in Hobbes' state of nature, of a war of every man against every man where might makes right? Do we really think that's safer and will be better for us? Right now, our might is not even helping us achieve stealing the oil, and instead it's making all of our lives worse. I certainly want us to be the good guys. I want that to be what America and Americanness stands for. I want us to align with our founding ideals and principles and make good on them, not just use it as rhetoric, to actually help make the world a better place for everyone, with liberty and justice for all. A peace, stable, and prosperous world. Might be idealistic, but I think it's sure worth aiming for. And for now, I'll leave you to ponder that. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope it was interesting and educational. If you want more content like this, feel free to look through my Substack and YouTube channels and do subscribe. I put out new content every Friday, and if you subscribe, you'll get a notification. It also helps the numbers and algorithms get my content to more people. So I really appreciate all of you who have subscribed, watched, and commented. Also, I post an essay on the same topic every week that goes into a little bit more detail and has a little bit more structured argumentation. So if you're interested in that, you can head over to the Substack. For now, thanks again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.